Welcome back to a Loaded Dice post-game analysis where we take a look at last week's battle report, mull over what worked and what didn't as we try to glean new understanding for future games of 40k. If you haven't seen the battle report, it's Drukhari taking on the Deathwatch. Go check it out now because we're about to dive in depth. I've put a link in the video, spoilers ahead. Okay, let's take a quick look at the list so we know what we're dealing with here. For Drukhari, we have a triple patrol, Cabal of the Poisoned Tongue, Cult of Strife, and a custom coven which is Artists of Flesh. The Cabal is headed by an Archon with a Venom Blade, Blast Pistol, Splintered Genius, and I've used Tolerated Ambition for a CP to give him Ancient Evil. The Cult is headed by the infamous Competitive Edge Triptych Whip Succubus with Adrenalite, who punches up so incredibly she is the Warlord, which then guarantees that I can use all of the Cult of Strife goodies. The Coven is headed up by an Alchemical Maestro Homunculus, so no Warlord traits here, but Prizes of the Dark City have been used for 1 CP to give him Poisoner's Ampule, which removes auras or denies auras from one unit once per game. For troops, there are 5 Cabalites with a Blaster, 10 Trueborn, 1 Darklance, 2 Blasters, 5 Witches with Power Sword and a Blast Pistol, 10 Hecatrix Blood Brides with Blast Pistol, Power Sword, Razor Flails, Hydro Gauntlets, and a Shardnet Impaler. The Witches all have Grave Lotus, which gives them +1 strength, rounding off with 5 Haymark Sights with Corrosive Whip, Hex Rifle, and an Ossifactor. Fast attack, we have 5 Scourges with 4 Dark Lances, and 2 squads of 3 Reavers with a Heat Lance in each. They're both using Splinter Mind, which gives them Ballistic Skill 2. In the elites we have 2 squads of 5 Incubi, nothing more to say there. Heavy support are 3 Talos with Ichor Injectors, Macro Scalpels, and Heat Lances. They are divided into 2 squads, 1 of 1 and 1 of 2. The transports are all Poisoned Tongue. The 5-man squad of Cabalites go in a Venom with double Splinter Cannons, 5 Witches go in a Venom with Grisly Trophies, 5 Incubi go in another Venom with Grisly Trophies, and then 5 Incubi accompany the Homunculus in the 4th Venom with Grisly Trophies. The Trueborn and Archon go in a Raider with Splinter Racks, the Blood Brides and the Succubus go in a 2nd Raider with Grisly Trophies and a Shock Prow. So overall we have 2 Raiders and 4 Venoms, leaving us with 2,000 points and 10 CP at the start of the game. A few observations on this list. This is nowhere near the average amount of Raiders in a Drukhari list. And as the Drukhari player of this game, this is just what I have available to me and what I'm doing. Ideally, I would like to take out a Venom or 2 and add a 3rd Raider. I think Venoms are kind of overpriced by comparison, or rather that Splinter Cannons are overpriced, which is one of the reasons why you don't see them. Put it this way, taking a 3rd Raider would actually lower the cost of my list and I would have more points to play with. That said though, having only 2 Raiders does have an advantage. Everyone has drummed it into their head that they have to efficiently kill Raiders as fast as possible, and it can lull opponents into this false perception that if they can pop the 2 Raiders, the list will fall over. This list sidesteps this issue in 2 ways. The first is that this is Poisoned Tongue, which means I have access to Insidious Misdirection, which allows me to redeploy 3 units and put them in reserve for the neat cost of 2 CP. On a board with adequate terrain, this just means I can deploy very defensively, and in the worst case scenario, I can choose for the Raiders and a Venom to not be on the board at all. I've never come across that scenario, but we'll see if it comes up. So the strat is really the only reason I take Poisoned Tongue. Having my poisoned weapons wound on 3s and the unlikely combat attrition benefits are just nice when they matter. But the redeploy in my mind counters the main method of anti-Drukhari skew lists as best as a humble denizen of the Dark City can, right? The other reason I'm maybe not as dependent on Raiders as other Drukhari lists might be is because of the 3 Talos, the Reavers, Blast Pistols, Darklance Scourges, and Trueborn. There is a Strength 8, AP -4 D6 damage weapon on the majority of units on the table. The Coven element of this list is purely to give me a bit of an anvil. Being Artists of Flesh, it means that everything that is in this Coven, in this list at least, is -1 damage. And honestly, I kind of overlooked this until I played a TTS game as Death Guard, and ever since then my eyes have been opened. Now the combo with, -1 damage, a 6-up invuln, 5-up feel no pain, a 3-up save, it makes these 3 Talos incredibly uncomfortable to play into, especially if your opponent brings the current flavor of anti-Drukhari weaponry that's floating around at the moment. Of course, splitting them into squads of 1 and 2 does make things a little less efficient for me when it comes to strats, but it adds another layer of difficulty for my opponent and lets me have one as a throwaway or as bait. And the last thing I like about them is also that they have the reliable access to mortal wounds with the Ichor injectors. They just hit in combat, and if they hit, they do D3 mortal wounds, which I think is fantastic. Our Cult of Strife contingent is, look, it's unfortunate. As someone that tried to make witches work in 8th, I think it's wonderful that they play like you imagine them from the fiction. I have a soft spot for the Cult of Red Grief because they have the coolest stratagem. I think jumping out of a raider, dunking on a unit, and then jumping back into the transport is awesome, and it has legs in this edition. But the Cult of Strife supplement is simply too good. Ideally, I would like to have seen these strats and relics divided amongst the cults, and then just have it be a quote-unquote cult everything supplement. But that's neither here nor there. We are where we are. Everyone knows the Triptych Whip competitive edge combo. At this point, she's a monster, and as I've mentioned, Cult of Strife units will just scale in efficiency and flexibility as long as you have CP to pump into them. Where the list diverges from the norm is that I take 10 Blood Brides, where most people would take just 10 stock standard witches. I'm likely in the minority in that I believe that the AP boost on 6s is worth the cost. A great example of this is Dreadnoughts. Sometimes I can just get unlucky with Incubi and have terrible hit and wound rolls and then bounce, and anything that does go through gets reduced. But if I throw reroll wounds on Blood Brides, it's not a question anymore. There are just so many attacks, and on average 50% of the wound rolls that do go through the Dreadnought doesn't get a save. I think that's great. Normal witches can also bounce in this scenario, kind of like the Incubi, and remember that there's ignore AP -1 and 2 floating around too, so you can't even boost up to AP -2 on normal witches to, have a good time. So anyways, that's why. Pay some points, make sure it's dead. The Reaver jet bikes are incredibly cheeky. They are a utility unit, one of the fastest units in the game. You cannot stop me from getting engaged. They move block, they wrap, they steal objectives, they screen, and it's incredibly hard to hide from their heat lances that hit on 2s. The last thing I'll mention are the Scourges. Haywire and Heat Lancers becoming heavy weapons was a devastating blow for Scourges, no doubt about it. But I believe Dark Lancers have a place. I think others may prefer to take a Ravager in this instance, but hear me out. You have 4 Dark Lancers that hit on 4s, 95% of the time, but it never gets worse. There is no way for your opponent to make this worse. If you take a Ravager, you have 3 shots, hitting on 3s, but 50 to 40% of the time, those 3 shots are hitting on 4s, which is actually worse. Defensively, after the hidden wound rolls, you have the same defensive stats, and they both fire and fade. Ravagers are tougher and more wounds, but I'd argue that most weapons that can touch you at 36 inches are low rate of fire and higher quality. Say it's something like a las cannon, you can always just kill the Solarite, for example, and be done with it. You still have your 4 Dark Lancers. Obviously, we can talk about the pros and cons all day, but the point I wanted to make is whether it's a Ravager or Scourges, A, you're still going to fire and fade them, and B, the average firepower is about the same for both. Okay, let's have a look at the Deathwatch list. Ridden and piloted by Ken, this is a battalion. We have a captain on bike. He is the warlord with Adepts of the Codex as his trait, carrying the Dominus Aegis and a chainsword. A Primaris chaplain on bike with Master of Sanctity, using Hero of the Chapter and Relics of the Chapter for 2 CP to get Wise Orator and Beacon Angelus. Chosen litanies are Catechism of Fire and Recitation of Focus. Finally, a librarian using Relics of the Chapter to get Tome of Ectoclades for 1 CP. Premorphic Resonance and Fortified with Contempt are the chosen psychic powers. For troops, we have 2 Fortis kill teams, which have a base of 5 auto bolter intercessors. One has 5 outriders and the Aquila specialism, and the other has 4 assault hellblasters. Finally, there's an Indomitor kill team with 5 heavy intercessors, rocking Hellstorm bolt rifles, 3 Flamestorm aggressors, and 2 bolt interceptors. And they have the Dominatus specialism, which gives them reroll 1s to hit against elites. In the elites, we have a Chief Apothecary using Hero of the Chapter to give him Selfless Healer for 1 CP, an Invictor with the autocannon loadout, a Redemptor with Macroplasma, Stormbolters, Onslaught Gatling, and an Icarus Rocket Pod. And finally, 4 Servitors with Servo Arms. In the heavy support, we have 3 Eliminators with the Carbine on the Sergeant, and 3 Eradicators. The list starts with 8 CP and is 1997 points. Alright, so the first thing we will notice straight away is that there is just a single Redemptor and no Contemptors in sight. This is just like my lack of Raiders. Ken only has 1 Redemptor at the moment, though I'm sure that he would like to sub out his Invictor for a second Redemptor if he could. It's unlikely that we'll see Volkite Contemptors on this channel because Forge World is expensive in Australia, and let's be real, it's a phase. If or when Drukhari get adjusted or a new faction comes out that dunks on them, they will likely fade from the meta. So it's something we see as being transient, and it's more productive in our opinion to invest in things that have legs later into the edition and hopefully beyond. Perhaps we'll change our minds in the future, but that's our stance. This list focuses hard on being an immovable object that's spiky to deal with. It does a pretty good job of that too. Everything around the captain on bike that is core gets a 5-up invuln, including the Redemptor. You then pick the Indomitor kill team to give it Premorphic Resonance and Fortified with Contempt, which gives it a 5-up in Overwatch, Fight First, and a 5-up Feel No Pain. Throw on Transhuman for seasoning and a cheeky res from the Apothecary, and your opponent can get quite depressed. Especially when you consider that you have to kill 5 heavy intercessors before you actually get to killing what you actually want to kill. Focusing on the Indomitor kill team for a minute, let's discuss why it works in Deathwatch. The downside of something like the Indomitor kill team is that it's slow. Most of the units move 5 inches or so in any other chapter, and this would be no good. Deathwatch get around this by either spending CP to put them in the Teleportarium, giving them Deep Strike, or you can use the Beacon Angelus relic on the Chaplain, and suddenly this unit gets to shunt to the Chaplain once per game. So once per game they get to be like Fat Eldari. You then give them a +1 to hit and +1 to wound the closest visible enemy with the Chaplain's Litanies in the command phase. Deathwatch choose which doctrine they are in at the beginning of each battle round. And finally, this unit rerolls 1s to wound against elites. But if you choose elites as your quarry as part of your chapter tactic, you get to reroll all wounds. So add it all together, if you're shooting into elites, you get 66 flamer shots with +1 to wound, AP -1. 15 strength 5 shots hitting on 2s, AP -1 +1 to wound. 12 strength 5 shots hitting on 2s with +1 to wound and -2 AP. And then you re-roll all the wounds. Ideally, you also want your opponent to charge you so you can eke out more out of the flamers. And then the aggressors get to fight you with their power fists too. And remember that if your opponent multi-charges, you'll actually get a free interrupt with this squad because they have Fight First from Premorphic Resonance, the psychic power. Now, that's a lot of ducks to set in a row. Remember that if all of this fails, you still have the Tome of Ectoclades on the Librarian to trigger reroll all wounds against a specific data sheet. So if the stars don't align, you have that emergency override, if you like, to still get the damage out. So essentially the Indomitor kill team is the core of the list, and the Redemptor and Invictor act as heavy fire support, with the Invictor being more of a throwaway if you need it. Of course, you don't have to buff the Indomitor kill team. Another good option might be the Fortis kill team with the Outriders. The Outriders combat squad off of that kill team so that they just become 5 OBSEC Outriders. The Outriders are then a great target for Brotherhood of Veterans, the stratagem that lets the Deathwatch choose a new chapter tactic for that squad. So you can turn them into White Scars, for example, to give them advance and charge, or you can turn them into Blood Angels for +1 to wound, or you can give them Whirlwind of Rage for exploding sixes. There's a lot of options there. So as you can see, they're a great buffing target as well if you don't want to expose your Indomitor kill team too early. The last kill team mentioned is simply a way to get a lot of plasma fire with a Blade of Wounds. So you negate the frailty of Hellblasters in a way that only Deathwatch can. So that's how they're made viable in this list. With all these elite bodies, you're probably wondering, how do you hold the home objectives? And that's why there are Servitors and Eliminators in this list. The Servitors are the cheapest unit available to Space Marines, and the Eliminators are competitively priced at 75 points for 3 of them. As a bonus, you can give the Sergeant a Carbine, and then you have a free fire and fade all game long, which actually makes them incredibly fast and durable for what they are if you can get them into cover. Again, remember that this is Deathwatch. There have been times where I have purposely activated the Assault Doctrine and sent the Eliminators to bully some T3 objective holding units off of a point to surprising effect. So they are remarkably versatile, and you don't have to feel bad if you lose them, which is great. That can't be said for most things in the Space Marines Codex. The last unit I want to talk about are the Eradicators. They are going to go in the Teleportarium 99% of the time, because that negates the problem that most Space Marines have with Eradicators, in that they can't get them up the field before they die, or their transports get shot and you have to pay for very expensive transports. So they usually come down in a pocket somewhere and solve some problem for the list when needed. So that's the lists. Let's talk about the mission, which is Surround and Destroy. This one always makes me a bit nervous because it's a long edge deployment with 2 objectives in your deployment at each corner. And then there are 2 evenly spaced in the middle of the map. I should be happy because I'm the Drukhari player and I can literally reach my opponent's home objectives turn 1. But on the flip side, long edge deployments reduce the cover from obscuring terrain. Think of it like there is a triangle of obscuring cover extending from the back of your terrain. The closer your opponent can get and the wider of an angle they can create, the more the apex of your quote-unquote triangle recedes towards the cover itself. I'm just saying in a roundabout way that the takeaway is that obscuring terrain is less effective on a long edge deployment. And seeing the Deathwatch list, I knew that if I presented the opportunity, Ken could deal a crippling blow to me early game. So that's what's going through my head. The primary objective for this one is take and hold, so you score 5 for holding 1 objective, 10 for holding 2 objectives, and then 15 if you hold more than your opponent. The optional secondary is surround them, and you score 4 victory points if you hold your 2 home objectives and 1 of your opponent's home objectives, or you score 8 victory points if you hold your 2 home objectives and your opponent's 2 home objectives, which is, I wouldn't take this one 99% of the time unless I knew I was going to win by a lot already, so it's kind of a redundant secondary, so yeah, we don't have to talk about it really. For terrain, we had 3 pieces of obscuring terrain for each objective, each corner of the map, and then 1 in the middle for each deployment zone. And then we also had L-shaped ruins in the middle, kind of half protecting each of the middle objectives. We had 2 pieces of dents on either side outside of those ruins, and then we also had a pipeline, which was a barricade in the middle that was also dense terrain. For secondaries, Drukhari took Take Them Alive, Engage on All Fronts, and Retrieve Octaria's Data. Deathwatch took Raise the Banners High, Oaths of Movement, and Cull Order. Normally, against elite armies, I would prefer to take Herd the Prey, and then force them to come to me, which usually results in the slow elements of their army being left behind by their fast elements, leaving them in bite-sized packages. But the Deathwatch are fast enough that I cannot really stop them from getting to the center on a long edge deployment, and then from there, their movement is enough to deny me those points. So I took engage on all fronts instead, to use it in the opposite sense, where if Deathwatch take the center to get on those middle objectives, I can just go everywhere that is not the center and stretch their resources across the board to deal with my stuff. Get some victory points, and then collapse on the weakest point. Such was my thinking. I took Retrieve Octarius data because that synergizes well with wanting to spread across the map, and Take Them Alive works well because it's kind of a passive. I get a victory point for killing things in melee, and the Apothecary and Librarian don't have invulns. My only gripe with it is that if you shoot, you can shoot yourself in the foot by killing a character in the wrong way, or kill two at once, and then you miss out. But I'm not complaining, it's a solid secondary. Onto the Deathwatch ones. Oaths of Moment is great for Deathwatch on this mission since the two closest objectives are in the center. You can basically sit in the center and just guard the middle two objectives and then hold one of the home objectives. And as long as you can hold those and react to Drukhari, you're off to a good start. After speaking with Ken, we've come to the conclusion that Raise the Banners is likely dead to Deathwatch. He got away with it versus the Sisters, but Drukhari really hates Space Marine banners, so much so that they go and tear them down wherever they go. And Space Marines also hate their own banners because they want to be doing stuff rather than putting them up. So unless one takes the optimized priority Warlord trait, it probably won't see play again. Taking Color Order was a bit of a trap too, unfortunately. Ken chose heavy support, which includes transports, so I then chose fast attacks and HQs. This meant that he had to kill all of my Venoms, Raiders, and Talos to get 5 victory points, kill all of my Reavers and Scourges to get another 5, which were on opposite ends of the table, at least that was my plan, and then kill all of my characters, one of which gets up the first time they die on a 2+, to get the last 5. So it was a tough order. Let's move on to deployment. Deathwatch deployed as any Space Marine army would, as close to the center as possible with the big stuff. We had Servitors holding the home objective solo, and then 5 Intercessors and the Eliminators holding the other home objective. The Invicta deployed up behind a ruin near one of the center objectives, so most of the army was obscured. But as I explained earlier, whoever goes first can exploit the angles if they wanted to. Drukhari decided to split deploy, with roughly half of the forces on one home objective and the other half on the other. I did place a Venom and a Talos behind the centerpiece of obscuring terrain, so they could peel either way if they needed to. I did choose to place both my Raiders to the one side. Basically, I have 3 free drops that don't count. So what I try to do is stack 3 extra vehicles to one side, still defensively deployed, and see what my opponent does. If they try to deploy in such a way that it's obvious that they're trying to get an angle on me, I'll simply commit hard to the other side and try and capitalize on that mistake. In the simplest sense, I will go wherever you don't want me to go, or at least to the best of my ability. Deathwatch didn't take the bait though. They deployed quite safely, but they had options to collapse to, on either side if they wanted to. Alright, so let's start at the end and work back. Drukhari took the game when Deathwatch conceded at the end of turn 4 with an 8-point lead. So 48 to 40 points, not counting the painting score because it's not, relevant for our purposes. Okay, so Drukhari's scoring went something like this. For primary, 10 on the second turn, 10, 10. For engage on all fronts, we had 3, 3, 2, 0. For Rod, we had 0, 4, 8. And then for Take Them Alive, we had 1, 4, and 1. Deathwatch scored 10, 5, 10 for primary, then 0, 1, 0, 0 for Raise the Banners, and then 0, 0, 5, 0 for Call Order. So it's quite apparent that the Deathwatch were let down somewhat by their secondaries. I know that if we had a do-over, that Ken would swap Oaths of Moment for Suffer Not the Alien, and I know that banners would be out. Theoretically, something like To the Last should be a strong answer to the Drukhari, but in hindsight, you may not have been able to keep them alive and play the primary game. Of course, Stranglehold is also a good option, but let's see what the future holds. Okay, let's move on and look at some tactical areas and maybe what we could have done differently, starting with Drukhari. Surprisingly, Deathwatch got the only call order that I thought that they wouldn't get, which was my fast attacks. And now I feel stupid for talking up my Scourges when they were demolished. But hear me out, that was my fault. I moved them out to fire the Redemptor and then faded them back into the same cover that they came from. But this cover was the same side as the Raider that the Deathwatch targeted on the first turn, which, as we discussed earlier, reduced my angle for that obscuring cover. And the Indomitor kill team has 36-inch range on their Hellstorm bolters, which is why they died. If I instead fully leveraged their 14-inch movement and got closer to the middle terrain and then fired and faded them behind that middle terrain, then the Deathwatch wouldn't have been able to close that angle. So there you have it. My second big mistake was that I used lightning fast reactions on my Incubi after they bounced off of the Outriders. It's bad because I was being far too kind to them, and the other reason is that I mentally mixed up light and heavy cover in my head, so I thought that they had a 2-up save, but they didn't. I think I was being a little hopeful even if they did have a 2-up save. Wasting the CP had like a knock-on effect, which meant that I didn't have the budget to save my Hecatrix Blood Brides in the morale phase. And the difference between having 5 instead of 3 would have meant that the Invictor would have died a turn earlier, and then that meant that I would have an extra resource to spend, or I could have maxed out on Retrieve Octarius data, or Engage. So I need to work on my CP discipline. Those were the major mistakes I noticed as the Drukhari player. Of course, it's hard to notice your own mistakes when you're on the winning side, because essentially I got away with them. So if you catch any of these mistakes, please point them out in the comments below, because I'm always open to feedback. I want to grow as a player. As an overall strategy, everything worked more or less the way I envisioned it. I didn't expect the Deathwatch to attempt to commit so early to my Trueborn Raider on the first turn, but it was an ideal scenario for me because the Deathwatch had to stretch themselves to close the angle, and then the Raider survived on a single wound, which was honestly really annoying, though they got a Venom for their troubles. In doing this, the Deathwatch exposed their Redemptor and couldn't get in range with the Dominus Aegis to protect it, which made it a prime target for my Dark Lancers. So in return, I enacted my plan, which was kill the Redemptor and go anywhere but the middle. The way that the ruins were arranged on the table made it fairly safe for whoever holds the center, but it also makes the flanks outside of those ruins safe from anything that is in the center. From there I could collapse on the weakest points. Now, don't get me wrong, the Deathwatch certainly didn't just sit there and let me do what I wanted. I took some major losses turn 2. But it wasn't nearly as bad as it could have been if I let the Deathwatch consolidate their assets on a single firing lane in an ideal, range spectrum. The second part of my strategy was to stall the forces in the middle long enough to set up for my turn 2 Sucker Punch. I know from playing the Deathwatch myself that this particular Indomitor kill team runs out of steam after 2 turns of Tactical Doctrine, because most things are AP-0, so you need the Tactical Doctrine to get AP-1. Conversely, Talos only gets stronger as the turns roll on, and the Poisoner's Ampule is quite a strong relic in this matchup too, because it turns off every defensive buff that the Deathwatch have aside from the psychic ones. And unfortunately, those buffs only work on 1 unit at a time. So I could really pick between the Indomitor kill team and the Outriders, whichever one didn't have the buffs. And if I remove either of those, it would have conceded an objective, and it would be quite a large blow to the army because there's a lot of points tied up in those 2 units. Since the tactical doctrines had already passed, the Indomitor kill team was much less of a threat to me, and of course killing the Apothecary and the Captain in combination as well meant that there wasn't a way for the Deathwatch to buff themselves back up to those scary levels of durability once again after I had done my thing. Unfortunately, it's just me this time, so I can't go into great depth on the Deathwatch's overall strategy, other than what I can observe and what has been revealed to me. It's apparent that the plan was to try and ground as many of my units as fast as possible, so I would have to engage in the middle where the Deathwatch was the strongest, if I wanted to contest objectives. It's a solid plan. In this meta, this is kind of how all Space Marine lists play, so there's no fault in that, really. I'll briefly touch on some mistakes that I noticed, but I want to emphasize that we are learning together from our mistakes, and the intent is not to bash our opponents and their ability, but to help each other grow. The first mistake that I noticed, and we touched on this a little bit before, was that the Deathwatch stretched too far to get an angle on my raider turn 1. Sure, they could have removed a raider, but the end result was that the Redemptor was exposed and then died. There were two other tactical areas that I noticed that kind of fall into the same category, so I'll address them together. The one instance was charging the Blood Brides with the Invicta Warsuit, which then gave the Blood Brides free movement, which helped me steal an objective. The other was when the Deathwatch charged their Intercessors off of their point to punch one of my Venoms, which then gave Drukhari the opportunity to steal that objective with non-obsec models and take down their banner. So the moral of the story here is just to be aware of where obsec models are and how they may interact with the objectives around them. Before we finish up, let's look at a bit of list optimization. As the Drukhari player, I'm quite happy with my list. The Talos were the MVPs and the Incubi were actually not so hot. So there you go, internet. Drukhari does bleed. As I mentioned earlier, I would dearly like to include a third raider, because it just saves me a lot of points, especially because this list has so many upgrades. I could remove some of those upgrades, which then lets me put in another unit or two. I think after a raider, I'd like some mandrakes for utility, so I'm toying around with that idea. I'll have to buy some. And then I'm also thinking of subbing out a single Talos, so that one squad of one, for a Kronos, which would give me some access to some strats and just broaden my toolkit. I mean, I think it's pretty funny if you manage to kill one of the Talos and then the Kronos manages to bring it back. That's just rubbing salt in the wound, which is what Drukhari does, so why wouldn't I? That said though, I'm a bit reluctant because I actually really like the Ichor injectors on the Talos. I like having that one Talos there where it's a pain if you don't kill it, because it just sits there in combat essentially smiting you until you do. My other option is to just give up on that third Talos or Kronos unit altogether and then put in Drazar, which then would make my Incubi shine, like the adorable devils they are. So those are some options. As for Deathwatch, obviously how I would pilot a list doesn't necessarily work for other people, so you have to take what I say with a grain of salt. I think the core Indomita kill team with all the buffing and shenanigans are great, and I mean that unit alone puts in serious work game after game, and I know that a second Redemptor is on the cards. Redemptors are always solid, which is why I make it such a high priority to remove them. The OBSEC Outriders are also really good, but I think there's a bit of anti-synergy when you combine them with the Indomita kill team, because these are both big point sinks that compete for the same buffs, so you end up having these two units that are competing for attention from your librarian, and while he's looking after one of them, you can lose the other one. My gut tells me that Deathwatch could use a few more units that work independently and don't need attention from your HQs, but what that looks like is another question. I'm a really big fan of running Eliminators with the Carbine on the Sergeant, whether that be with las fusils to supplement your anti-vehicle or keep them cheap, and essentially you have the equivalent of a jump pack infantry that doesn't need support because they're ballistic skill 2 and they have a 1-up save, which is equivalent to an invuln in most scenarios. Of course, that's only one of many possible answers, so let's see what the future holds. The other thing I would consider is retooling the characters a little. I think that using a Judiciar instead of the Apothecary is quite enticing to me. Yes, you lose the ability to heal and bring back models, but it makes it so much harder for your opponent to interact with your big Indomita kill team. and he's a little bit of a beatstick as well. What you can do in Deathwatch is use Paragon of the Chapter for 1 CP to give him the Black Templars Warlord trait, which is Oathkeepers. This gives him a 6-inch heroic intervention. Put that together with Premorphic Resonance, which gives your unit a fight first, and he has a fight last, and you now hit units that charge you first, before they hit you. Bonus points if you upgrade your Librarian to be a Chief Librarian, so now they know Neural Void, which is a psychic power that reduces an opponent's unit's attack characteristic by 1, and then makes it so that they have to charge the closest unit, which is going to be the Indomitor Kill Team in most cases. As someone that depends on combat, this is a terrifying prospect and something to consider for the future. But let us know if you have any suggestions in the comment section below. Well, there you have it. I know the Deathwatch learned a lot from this game, and it certainly wasn't effortless on the Drukhari side either, so I can't sit here and be complacent. Let's see how the lists and the players adapt in the coming battle reports. That's all we have time for. Thank you for sticking through to the end. Please like and subscribe, and we'll be back real soon for another Loaded Dice battle report analysis. Bye now.